Hello, everybody. Welcome to TSAM Digital Regulations and Compliance. My name is Anam. I'm the head of content here at Fox On Media. With me here today is Linda Thielová from OneTrust. Linda is the Privacy Council lead at OneTrust. Hello, Linda. How are you?
Hi, Anam. I'm really good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much, Linda, for joining us today. Really appreciate you making time and joining us for this conversation.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Brilliant. Today, we're going to be discussing control management in reflection to regulatory compliance. And to kick off the conversation, my first question is, what makes control management more difficult with digital operations?
Right. I would say that on the face of it, the real key issue there is the general speed and scale of the GRC. When you look at the mature GRC practices these days, they really almost require an army of control managers to make sure that they're managing and tracking the distribution of controls across all the specialized business divisions, across all of your operations, services, and products. And while I appreciate that these roles can be actually quite essential as the contributors to the GRC program, unfortunately, you find that a lot of what they're doing day to day, all of their efforts are actually tied up in just trying to keep up with the tracking piece of what's going on within the company. So I would say that in my head is probably the biggest challenge in and difficulty in what the businesses are facing right now, because you're essentially employing a lot of people to just track what's happening. However, if you take that, I would say, next step and you start streamlining the piece which is focusing on documenting and organizing and tracking correlated controls across those related practices, you can finally get to a piece where you're optimizing the human resources in a way where these people are more able to focus on the risk analysis piece, which is ultimately what they're here for, and also on informing the leadership about those risks that you need to be aware of. So I would say that's kind of the outlook for the future in terms of how to overcome those key challenges as well.
And how can taking a risk-based approach help in control management with general regulatory compliance?
Right. I would say, in a sense, the biggest advantage, at least in my head, would be that it allows the business to be way more flexible. So it gives you the opportunity to really hone in on those processes or applications or products which in your head really pose the greatest risk. So this would not just be, so to speak, in your head, but hopefully you also have a risk matrix to bumper it up again. However, I would say the prioritization is another key benefit in the sense that you as a business have the ability through the risk-based approach to decide, okay, these particular processes would be posing the highest risk to me in terms of what could be the outcome if there is a breach or if we just don't follow the controls specifically. The threats are really the highest here. And on that regard, you're able to allocate your resources way better because you determine that majority of the resources should really be focusing on those high risk controls and high risk operations. This will in turn allow you to produce more gains and less costs, and hopefully at the expense of less personnel. And the way it translates into the regulatory compliance in my head is that very similarly to keeping tabs with your regular security risks, you also need to specifically look into what particular regulatory risks you're facing. And one of them would definitely be the overlay of multiple compliance regulations that you need to be dealing with. And just to give you a few examples, the Payment Services Directive, the NIS Directive, the GDPR, very often you find yourself at the intersection of multiple of these laws. And you will be actually relying on a control which would be, again, covering multitude of these regulatory obligations. So being able to flag these controls and these processes as high risk and allocating those resources to them, I would see as really critical for businesses to make sure that they can avoid any penalties or any bad press, basically trickling down from the fact that they didn't really follow the rules just as well as they were supposed to.
And what are some of the roadblocks organizations have faced when trying to track manage digital risk with legacy systems?
Good question. I would say that we had our customers talking through this to us on a multitude of times when they were dealing with their legacy systems. One of them to highlight is, unfortunately, the sheer complexity of things. So typically, as I mentioned, you have your team of GRC control managers, almost like an army, and they're navigating through that particular system, which very often is not very user-friendly to begin with. And those people, they're really in the weeds. So they really understand, they're privy to what are the controls, what are the risks related, what is the market position, how do you assign risk value. But they're also very often siloed away from the rest of the organization. That knowledge is really centered just on that particular team, and everybody else outside of the company, of the team, is basically kind of in the dark on it. So the way it translates into, I would say, the hardship for the businesses is that once you start treating those risks, you are faced as the GRC team with the obligation to basically assign tasks to people outside of the team who don't really have much of understanding in terms of whether this is actually a priority, how it translates to their position, why is it even important for them to be doing those things you're asking them to do. And even more importantly, it's extremely hard to track how are these people actually progressing in terms of the treatment and management of these risks through the controls. So tracking that progress in some auditable way while keeping the ownership with the people where it's supposed to be with, not with the GRC team, but actual project owners, that is something that we're seeing as a major challenge with those legacy systems.
And what are some of the best practices or enterprise blind spots you see in the market around security and employee monitoring?
Right. Let me start with the blind spots, just because I like fixating on the negative. No, I'm sorry, but it's fascinating because there's so many of them. I would say the biggest one that we are seeing pop up very often, especially with respect to incidents, and you can see it in statistics pretty much all across the board, is the human factor. So human factor translates a lot in terms of how do we actually prevent and deal with security and compliance incidents. And we are seeing more and more of our customers actually honing in on the prevention piece as well. And I would say the key critical element of that prevention is really having a very good, robust, and efficient training. And by robust, I don't mean hours and hours of training where the people are falling asleep in the middle of it, but really making it quite interactive and making it very well tailored to the position of that particular employee. So you don't really need your receptionist to have the same type of training as your management. You actually need it to be way specific to their roles. So some of them might be focusing more on the physical security of things, whereas others will need to be focusing more on the information security, for instance. So you really, I guess, by the fact that you're even tailoring that to their roles, you're making it easier to access and understand for them. That would be the first piece. You're making it more relevant. And secondly, the interactive point of it. And really, I would say not treating the PR and user accessibility as a curse word, really making it easy and nice and flashy just for the people to remember. That's something that I think can never be understated, because you really depend on the people taking away that information and taking away that knowledge, especially with respect to also reporting incidents, because that's another piece which depends on the human factor. And the underreporting of incidents has been a very, very essential piece for companies to make sure that they are compliant. And that has been an issue historically, where people just didn't know that something would qualify as an incident. They were just not trained enough on that. So making sure that this is a prime part of that particular training that people are having based on their roles, that is really, I would say, crucial in my head. And I would say discussing the employee monitoring as such and the security of it, we should probably mention one blind spot, which is become more prominent these days with the lockdown situation, everyone working from home, and that is the mobile security as such. So we're definitely looking at a situation where people are working from home these days, probably 100%, at least that's, for instance, my experience now. And they're using multiple devices. They're relying on mobile devices. Sometimes they would be even using their own home devices to access their company emails or some applications. And that definitely poses a whole set of risks. Also, the fact is that ever since we have been starting to work more remotely, we're using more interactive tools. And I'm sure most of us are aware of the whole story around Zoom and all the other applications for video conferencing. So just the fact that you need to be able to monitor these is a key challenge on its own, and we should be able to do that a bit more. However, one last thing I wanted to mention in respect to these blind spots is also the fact that we need to be really good at role management as well. So again, something that it's really easy to, I guess, slip on and just like go into the habit of ignoring is the fact that there are so many people who are just increasing in numbers as super admins for each application. And I know that's kind of like a nightmare for every security person out there, but just, I would say, staying on top of this, understanding that maybe you should need like 3 people to manage that particular application from that super admin role, and just like cracking in on that creeping number that is always, I mean, it's human. Everyone, when they're trying to fix the problem, would just first ask you to be a super admin rather than trying to find some other way. But just being able to stay on top of it and make sure that the number doesn't creep up too much is one thing that is common blind spot, I would say, and should be treated as such. Now, in terms of those best practices, in terms of the employee monitoring and security as such, I would say one of the best practices really is a lot about transparency and communication. So again, I hate to say it, but it does boil down to training. So firstly, communicating to the employees what is and what is not expected from them in terms of which devices can they be using, which applications can they be using. And then obviously on top of it, being open and accessible in terms of their requests for further applications. So again, the last thing you want to be dealing with is employee installing some type of software just because they felt that they didn't have enough tools that they could be using, or they felt like they would not be heard if they requested this particular application. So you need to make it very easy and transparent to deal with these types of requests, and maybe keeping an open mind in terms of not always saying no, which I, particularly on a personal level, find challenging for us compliance people, because it's always easier to say no than just to be like a bit more open-minded. But especially with these employee-generated requests around those applications, I find it that this is actually key. Finding ways to work around what the people need rather than work against them is really paramount. And that's actually what I see a lot of companies getting really, really good at. So rather than saying unblock that you can't really use Zoom or you can't really use WhatsApp, they're trying to find ways how to do it in a compliant and secure manner. And that will in turn translate into them being on top of potential incidents and being aware of any potential risks that might be generated there. So on a general sense, that's a theme that I'm seeing with a lot of our customers who are doing a great job in that respect, that they are very well aware of what is happening with the data, and they're well aware of what's happening with the way that employees are treating these applications when they're working from home. So that's definitely, I would say, a good lesson to learn. Yeah.
No, brilliant. And one last question that I have is around all the, you mentioned that now that we've moved on to working from home, and these different devices we're using and applications we're using are generating loads of data. What is the compliance as risk around associated with that data that has been generated, and what would you recommend organizations to be mindful of while dealing with that data?
No, absolutely. That's a great question. And I really like that you bring it up, because I think right now is a perfect timing for us to deep dive a little bit more into this, considering that lockdown is probably going to stretch for further multitude of months, as much as we all hate it. It's probably a good time for us to start tracking these risks a bit more in detail. So yes, as you said, it's definitely the key here that the applications that we're suddenly using more and more would be by essence generating more data. So I would say the first step, as always, is to monitor and figure out what is the mapping of this. Where does the data flow? What is the scale of the data? Which organizations would have access to it? And what are the safeguards which are guarding these transfers and these data flows? And this essentially also is quite helpful for all sorts of regulatory obligations that the businesses would be facing. So be it your privacy obligations with the GDPR and the whole situation around transfers to the US being right now put at I would say, greater scrutiny based on the Schrems II ruling. What this translates into on the day-to-day job of your average security person is asking that question, okay, where does the database actually sit? Or when we're transferring the data to our vendor, and this may be your average software vendor, what types of data are these, and what are the safeguards that they're putting in place to protect the data? Is the encryption in transit also, or is it just in rest? All of these questions actually are not just helpful just for your security piece, but they'll be absolutely super helpful for your privacy and compliance teams as well, because they will need to be asking those questions if you don't as a security person. Now, this also, I would say, takes a step next as a way that you try to manage this risk. So again, this would be very similar to the way you treat your risks under your typical regulatory compliance obligations, but it also is very similar in the way you look at them from your perspective of security certifications. So such as your ISO 27001, this will be very similar approach when you're trying to manage these risks. So first step would really be to figure out, okay, is there a way we can minimize that risk or mitigate it in any way? So for instance, with the data flows, just the question whether you need the system to have access to all of these databases, or maybe limiting the scale of it, or maybe limiting the exposure of the teams, how many teams are exposed to that particular system. Or, as I said earlier, the fact that the site admins are just so numerous and there's no good reason for it. So all of these things could actually add up to mitigating the overall risks that are posed by this particular system or by that particular application. But again, as always, the fact that you're aware of which particular data elements are stored in the system, whether this would be confidential, sensitive, or personal data as such, is really helpful for you just to be able to pinpoint any issues if there is an incident reported. So the fact that you're already mitigating these risks, and the fact that you're tracking those vendors, making sure that there are any updates with them in terms of them experiencing incidents or being, I don't know, subject to any enforcement action, all of that, staying on top of it, monitoring this, and making sure that the information you have on them is up to date. And this sort of circle notion of going through this as you're kind of working your way through the life cycle of all of these applications that are being used within your organization. That's probably the key way forward. I wish there were easier ways to do it, but I think this is probably the best. Yeah.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much, Linda, for this lovely conversation. Really appreciate your input. And thank you all for joining. Don't forget to join us again at TSAM Digital Regulations and Compliance on the 28th and 29th. Until then, thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.